The state of Kansas just admitted to planning its own suicide. For decades, the official government policy was to knowingly drain the single most important resource in the state until it was gone. They called it planned depletion, an economic strategy built on deliberate exhaustion. And now the plan has worked. The water that feeds America's breadbasket is disappearing. Not a shortage. Not a crisis. A countdown to zero. The wells are starting to suck air. And it's happening in places like Haskell County and Wallace County right now. Farmers are staring at multi-million-dollar operations that are months, maybe weeks, away from becoming worthless. The question you're probably asking is, how did this happen? Down in the comments, let us know if you've ever experienced water restrictions where you live. It's a reality more and more of us are facing. Let's begin. This isn't a story about a drought. This is a story about a heist. A 70-year-long operation to mine a resource that can never be replaced. And if you're new here, know that we only cover stories like this. Critical issues that fly under the radar. A majority of people who watch our documentaries forget to hit the subscribe button. Please don't be one of them. Take 1 second and click it. It's the only way to ensure these stories reach you. It's urgent. The water being pumped is ancient. Literally, it filtered down into the earth during the last ice age, between 20,000 and 26,000 years ago. Water older than human civilization itself, sealed underground in a sprawling geological formation of sand, gravel, and clay. This is not some underground lake or river. It is a titanic, waterlogged sponge. A sponge named the Ogallala. Discovered in 1898 by a Uskis geologist named Nelson Horatio Darton, who named it after a quiet Nebraska town. He had no way of knowing what he'd found. The largest underground freshwater system in the United States. A subterranean sea stretching 174,000 square miles under 8 states, from South Dakota to the Texas Panhandle. An inheritance of Pleistocene paleo water, trapped in the dark, waiting. For most of history, it stayed there. The Great Plains above were a semi-arid grassland, a place of brutal weather cycles and profound thirst. Early settlers even believed in a kind of magical thinking. A pseudoscience called rainfall follows the plow, convinced that breaking the prairie sod would release moisture into the air and summon the clouds. It didn't. It summoned the Dust Bowl. The 1930s turned the topsoil of the American heartland into a biblical plague of dust. The sky went black. Farms failed. Families fled. The nation's food supply chain was broken. The Ogallala was the answer. An agricultural salvation story. After the trauma of the Dust Bowl, farmers needed a failsafe, a guarantee against the whims of the sky, and it was right there, beneath their feet. The technology that unlocked it came after the war. In 1948, a farmer named Frank Zyback invented the center pivot irrigation system. At the same time, mass-produced diesel and electric pumps, repurposed from military and automotive engines, became cheap and powerful enough to drill deep into the earth. The combination was revolutionary. It transformed the dry, shortgrass prairie into one of the most productive agricultural zones on the planet. A single aquifer, the Ogallala, now yields 30% of all groundwater used for irrigation in the entire country. It supports nearly 20% of the nation's total agricultural output. The corn, the wheat, the cotton, the cattle that feed America and the world, much of it exists because of this one deposit of fossil water. It was a miracle built on a fundamental misunderstanding. For decades, farmers operated under the belief that the aquifer was constantly refilled by snowmelt from the distant Rocky Mountains. It was a comforting lie. The truth, geologists knew, was far more terrifying. The Ogallala had been geologically severed from the Rockies millions of years ago. The water they were pumping was a finite resource. They weren't farming. They were mining. And the mine was beginning to run empty. The numbers are staggering. In heavily irrigated zones across western Kansas and the Texas Panhandle, the aquifer is being pumped dry 15 to 30 times faster than nature can possibly refill it. The natural recharge rate in these areas is often less than 1 inch per year. A single season of growing corn can drain what took nature a century to deposit. Since 1950, Humans have pumped roughly 330 cubic kilometers of water out of the Ogallala, a volume loss of 9% across the entire system, but the damage is not spread evenly. The southern portions are in a state of terminal decline. Water tables in the hardest hit areas of Texas and Kansas have fallen over 200 feet. In some parts of Haskell County, the water level dropped 7 feet in a single year. These are not sustainable declines. This is a death spiral. When a Kansas Geological Survey scientist says a well has hit zero, it doesn't mean the rock is bone dry. What it means is that the saturated thickness, the depth of the water-soaked layer, has dropped so low that the massive, high-capacity pumps can no longer pull a steady stream. They start sucking a slurry of mud and air. The moment that happens, an irrigation operation built on that well is no longer economically viable. The farm goes dark. The equipment is sold for scrap. The land returns to dust. It is an economic event horizon. And hundreds of farms are now approaching it at full speed. The most shocking part of this entire catastrophe is that it was the plan all along. This was not an accident. It was a policy. For decades, the state of Kansas formally managed the Ogallala under a doctrine of planned depletion. The law itself codified and authorized the slow draining of the state's lifeblood for short-term economic gain. The government knew the water was running out. They just planned to ride the economy it created all the way to the bottom. Down in the comments, let us know the single most surprising detail you've heard so far. The fact that the government had a policy called planned depletion is still hard to process. Then, in December 2022, the Kansas Water Authority did something historic. In its annual report to the governor, the board made a formal public declaration. A single sentence that reversed 70 years of institutionalized self-destruction. Quote, "The policy of planned depletion of the Ogallala Aquifer is no longer in the best interest of the state of Kansas. It was an admission of failure. A desperate, 11th hour attempt to slam the brakes on a machine that had been running at full throttle for generations. The people in charge had finally, officially, stated the obvious. You cannot build a future by planning your own collapse. The question was whether the admission had come too late. The first real answer came not from the state capital, but from a small pocket of farmland in the state's northwest corner. A place called Sheridan County. Here, a group of farmers decided to attempt the unthinkable. They weren't just going to use less water. They were going to legally bind themselves and their neighbors to do it. They created something called the Sheridan 6 Lima, a local enhanced management area. It was the first of its kind in Kansas, a legally enforceable, farmer-led conservation zone. The goal was to cut water use by a mandatory 20% over 5 years, starting on January 1st, 2013. The idea was deeply controversial. In a culture where success was measured in bushels per acre, voluntarily capping your primary input felt like economic suicide. Bragging rights on the plains were about who had the highest yield, which often meant who pumped the most water. This new proposal felt like a government-mandated handicap, forcing farmers to compete with one hand tied behind their backs. The resistance was fierce. It pitted neighbor against neighbor. Those with older, more powerful water rights feared losing their advantage. Those with less felt it was the only way to keep their wells from dying. But the data was undeniable. B. Brownie Wilson, the water data manager at the Kansas Geological Survey, had spent years crisscrossing the state, dropping sensors into thousands of wells, measuring the decline foot by agonizing foot. His annual reports were a drumbeat of bad news. The aquifer was not stabilizing. It was in freefall. In Sheridan County, the need for a radical change was obvious to anyone who read the charts. After years of contentious local meetings in the county seat of Hoxie, the plan was approved. The farmers inside the Sheridan 6 Lima were now on an island, operating under a completely different set of rules than their neighbors just across the road. Then the results came in, and they shocked everyone. Over the first 5 years, the farmers in the Lima didn't just meet their 20% reduction goal, they exceeded it, cutting water use by an adjusted 26 to 28% compared to their historical baseline. They adapted. They shifted from thirsty crops like corn to more drought-tolerant options like sorghum. They invested in hyper-efficient irrigation technology, using soil moisture probes and advanced sprinklers to ensure every single drop was used, not wasted. They managed their water like a bank account, not a fire hose. And here's the part that changed everything. They made more money. An economic analysis found that the farmers inside the water restricted zone generated, on average, 3% more cash flow than their high-pumping neighbors just outside the Lima. More profit, with less water. The logic, in retrospect, was brutally simple. Water might seem free once you own the right to it, but pumping it is not. It costs a fortune in diesel and electricity to run the massive engines that pull water from hundreds of feet underground. By pumping a quarter less water, these farmers saved a massive amount on energy costs. The savings went directly to their bottom line. The Sheridan 6 experiment proved something that flew in the face of a century of agricultural tradition. Conservation wasn't a cost. It was a profit center. It wasn't about sacrificing yield. It was about maximizing the profit extracted from every single drop of water. The mentality began to shift from bushels per acre to profit per inch of water pumped. If this story is giving you a new perspective on where our food comes from, do us a favor and hit the like button. And if you have family or friends living in any of the 8 states that sit on top of this aquifer, share this documentary with them. This is their story. The success in Sheridan County was a proof of concept, a small, isolated victory against an overwhelming force of decline. But a single Lima covering a corner of one county wasn't going to save a 174,000 square mile aquifer. The real question was whether this model could be scaled. Could a culture built on extraction be convinced to embrace conservation? The experts were skeptical, but clear about the stakes. Jim Butler, a senior scientist at the KGs, ran the models. His research showed how specific percentage cuts in pumping could dramatically extend the lifespan of the aquifer, buying decades, even generations, of continued viability. But the necessary cuts were severe. Earl Lewis, the chief engineer for the Kansas Department of Agriculture, put it bluntly. The data shows us that in order to stabilize the aquifer or halt the decline, he said, some areas we may need a 15% cut, and in other areas we might need a 50% cut. 50%, an unthinkable number for an industry built on irrigation. It would mean a complete reinvention of farming on the high plains. Slowly, tentatively, the idea began to spread. In 2021, Wichita County, part of Groundwater Management District No. 1, followed Sheridan's lead and established its own Lima. Then, in the spring of 2023, GMD1 took a much bigger step. It voted to expand Lima-style restrictions across all 4 of its remaining counties. It was a sea change, a regional government finally acknowledging that the era of unlimited pumping was over. The state government began to mobilize. Governor Laura Kelly's administration started funneling real money toward the problem, allocating $35 million annually for the Kansas Water Plan and recently announcing an $85 million grant program to help communities invest in conservation and update crumbling water infrastructure. The reversal of the planned depletion policy by the Kansas Water Authority in 2022 wasn't just symbolic. It was a signal to every level of government that the old way of doing business was officially dead. The state was finally, belatedly, at war with its own self-fulfilling prophecy of decline. For a moment, it felt like a turning point, a story of a region pulling itself back from the brink through ingenuity, sacrifice, and a grudging acceptance of geological reality. A story of hope. But the aquifer doesn't care about hope, and the math remains unforgiving. The latest measurements from the Kansas Geological Survey, released in early 2026, delivered a dose of crushing reality. The state had experienced heavy rains in May and June of 2025. In south-central Kansas, where shallower aquifers like the Equus Beds and Great Bend Prairie lie, the water tables responded immediately. They shot up by an average of 2.5 feet, a rare and welcome surge of recharge. But in western Kansas, over the deep, ancient Ogallala, the story was completely different. The rain barely made a difference. Those aquifers are buried deep beneath thick layers of clay. Water percolates down at a glacial pace. While the East celebrated, the West continued to fall. The year before, data showed that parts of southwest Kansas had dropped by an alarming 1.52 feet in just 12 months. Despite the state's best efforts, despite the heroics of Sheridan County, despite the policy reversals and the new funding, the decline in the most critical parts of the system had not stopped. It hadn't even slowed down. The revival was a mirage. The crisis was real, and it was accelerating. The conservation efforts are not a failure. They are a desperate, necessary holding action. But they are up against a force far more powerful than local policy. They are up against geology, climate, and time. If the entire Ogallala were pumped dry, scientists estimate it would take at least 6,000 years for it to refill naturally. 6,000 years. The water being sprayed on a cornfield in Haskell County today is a non-renewable resource, as finite as oil or coal. I know this is the second time I'm asking, but the data shows that the vast majority of you who watch this far into our documentaries are not subscribed. If you believe this kind of storytelling is important, please take 1 second. It is the single most effective way to help our channel grow and ensure we can continue to produce this work. We can't do it without you. What happens next is not an academic question. It is a question of national security. The agricultural heartland of the United States was built on a resource that is now demonstrably failing. The Ogallala Aquifer was the safety net that protected America from a repeat of the Dust Bowl. When the next multi-decade mega drought arrives, and paleoclimate records show that it will, that safety net will be gone. The fight in Kansas is a preview of a conflict that will define the 21st century across the American West and in arid regions around the globe. A conflict between economic expectations and environmental reality. The Lima model offers a flicker of a different path, one where human ingenuity is focused not on more aggressive extraction, but on radical efficiency. It's a model that proves that economic vitality and resource sustainability are not mutually exclusive. But the scale of the crisis may have already outrun the scale of the solution. The cuts needed to truly stabilize the aquifer, 30, 40, even 50%, would require a social and economic transformation so profound that few are willing to contemplate it. It would mean rethinking what we grow, where we grow it, and for whom. It would mean accepting that some land that was once fertile farmland may have to return to being dry prairie. The farmers in Sheridan County bought time for their own wells, time for their communities, time for the state of Kansas to wake up. But the great, slow-motion emptying of the high plains continues. The center pivot irrigators still draw their circles on the landscape. The pumps still run deep into the night, pulling ice age water from the darkness to grow crops under a sun that offers too little rain. The plan to deplete the aquifer may be officially over, but the depletion itself is not. Under the cracking earth of western Kansas, the clock is still running down.